Welcome everyone to the World Affairs Council luncheon for April. It's great to have you here. It's great to be holding these luncheons back in person. I'm sure you're all, disappointed with that reality. No, it's fabulous to be back. As we come out of the pandemic, there are changes afoot to your World Affairs Council. One of the changes already implemented has been to go to an all-digital passport and system of communication with our members. If you're having any issues with that at all, please let us know. The passport editor is Elizabeth Robinson, no relation. Just kidding. But if you have any problem, just let her know, and we'll be sure to get it fixed. Also, just a plug for our website. Please visit it, wacmb.org. Because there you can find updates of everything that's happening, what the next speaker, for example, what's happening with our burgeoning discussion groups. Again, if you want to join one of those, I encourage that. And other activities. It's all on the website, so please have that bookmarked and visit it regularly to keep up with our expanding presentation of content in the World Affairs Council. And speaking of which, do mark your calendars. May 26 is going to be our next luncheon. Carolyn Halliday from the Naval Postgraduate School will be speaking on the changing nature of German politics, which is a very nice tie-in to today's lecture. We're going to do the question and answer. We'll have a Q&A period today, and we're going to do it the same way we've been doing it the last couple of luncheons. And that is, Liz will go around with her microphone. She'll hold on to it, just so we are not passing around things. The pandemic is still around us a bit. So she'll hold on to it, ask your question, and you can see it's a packed room, so just one question per person, and hopefully we can get to them all. But please don't have a long list of questions to ask. And again, so we can accommodate lots of people here. All right, it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Ambassador Steven Pifer, who will be speaking today on Russia and its war against Ukraine. He is the William J. Perry Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, where he's also affiliated with the Center for International Security and Cooperation, widely known as CSAC, and as well as the Europe Center at Stanford. He is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution, where he was actually a resident fellow for a number of years after retiring as a Foreign Service officer. He was in the U.S. Foreign Service for more than 25 years with the Department of State, and that included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Russia and Ukraine, as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, and a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. He also served at, at U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as in Geneva with the U.S. delegation to negotiation on intermediate-range nuclear forces. He is also an author. You can buy his book from Brookings entitled The Eagle and the Trident. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Steven Pifer.
Well, Glenn, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. We're on the West Coast, so I guess I should start off by saying that the big strategic challenge for the United States in the next 3 decades is China. And certainly when the Pentagon talks about the pacing military threat, that's China. But there's still only one country in the world that could physically destroy the United States in a matter of hours. That's Russia. And it's Russia that has unleashed the largest war in Europe since 1945. So we can't ignore Moscow. What I'm going to do is really try to talk about 3 things. First of all, in broad terms, what do Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin want? Second, what are some of the limitations on their ability to achieve those aims? And then I'll focus the bulk of my talk on Russia's war against Ukraine. And then I'll add in some comments about U.S. policy. So when you look at the Kremlin, it's not an easy place to figure out. I remember our ambassador, John Teft, who served there, came back and he said, it's harder now to understand the Kremlin than it was during Soviet times. Because at least during Soviet times, Every great October Revolution Day, the senior people would all line up on the Lenin Mausoleum to watch the parade, and you could say, ah, that guy's two places closer to the center, he's on the upswing. We don't have that kind of visibility. And we tend, I think, sometimes, and I fall into this trap talking about Vladimir Putin and really personalize it, but it's really Putin and a small group, inner circle in the Kremlin. Now, to be sure, Putin is the most dominant person to be in the Kremlin since Joseph Stalin in 1953. And that inner circle with him, they largely come out of the security services, former KGB. And so they share a world outlook and a view very similar to Putin's, including an adversarial view of the West. And there is no mechanism like the Politburo. So from 1953 until the end of the Soviet Union, you had the Politburo, and that had power. In 1964, the Politburo fired Nikita Khrushchev. There's no such mechanism like that today in the Kremlin. So what does that inner circle, what do they want? Well, first of all, they're very much focused on preserving the regime. That's job number one for the Kremlin. They have assembled over the last 22 years what Russians refer to as the power vertical, where major authority really resides at the top in the Kremlin. Now, they have also tried to maintain a democratic facade. So, for example, in the Duma, that's the Russian Federal Assembly, you have the Communist Party, it's an opposition party. You have the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is neither liberal nor democratic, also an opposition party. But those parties, when it comes to big issues that really matter to the Kremlin, uniformly fall in line with what the Kremlin wants. And I think over the past couple of years, we've actually seen this veneer of democracy really kind of fall away. It's really become a much more authoritarian and repressive system. You saw Alexei Navalny, who is the number one regime opponent. 2 years ago, he was poisoned by the Russian government. He's now in jail and will likely spend the next 9 or 10 years there. You saw the mass arrests that take place whenever there are any kind of public demonstrations. And the Russian government has put in a series of laws on foreign agents, laws on extremism, laws on undesirable organizations that are basically restricting the space for truly independent non-governmental organizations and the independent media. And so in many ways, there really is no space now for the non-systemic opposition. And it really looks very much like Soviet times. So that's one thing, regime survival. The second thing that the group in the Kremlin wants is they want to have a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. And in part that's because their perception of Russia as a great power, that's simply a facet. If you're a great power, you have a sphere of influence. And what that means is Moscow wants friendly governments in which Moscow can have a say not only in foreign policy, but on some domestic policy issues. They want neighbors that are open to Russian business and the corruption that brings. And they also want governments or countries that will defer to Russia on big geopolitical issues. So if there's a question, for example, about a relationship with NATO or the European Union, they want a neighbor who will check first with Moscow and get Russia's view. A third thing that the Russians want related to that is they want to see a multipolar world in which Russia is in fact recognized as one of the great powers. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov regularly says, no big issue in the world can be decided without Russia at the table. And that even counts on questions when Russia really doesn't have much to contribute at the table. Respect is also important. The Russians took great umbrage when President Obama called Russia a regional power. That did not go down well. But actually, if you take away Russian nuclear weapons, they really have limited ability to act outside the post-Soviet space. And when they do, it's mainly in disruptive terms. So you see this, for example, in Syria and the use of Russian military force there. But anytime the question has arisen about reconstruction in Syria, the first Russian talking point is, that's for the European Union to do. The fourth thing I think they want is they would like to change the post-Cold War settlement in Europe. Because they look at the changes over the past 30 years in Europe, things like the enlargement of NATO, the enlargement of the European Union, and these see those things as really disadvantaging Russian interests. So those are some of the four questions I think that sort of focus where the Kremlin wants, primarily in foreign policy terms, and they all come together on Ukraine, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, what's Russia's status to deliver on this? There's some pretty important limitations. The Russian economy is fairly stagnant now. It grew about 4% last year, but that was the rebound from COVID. But over the last 10 years, it's averaged about 1 to 1.5% per year. And the estimate is that the real standard of living in Russia is now about 10% below what it was in 2013. And that's all before the sanctions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, came into effect. And this is different for Russians because in the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency from 2000 to 2008, the Russian economy grew. I mean, in large part because the price of oil went up, and the Russian economy grew at an average of 5 to 7% a year. And I remember when I would travel to Moscow, then Russians would say, we have this informal social agreement with Putin. You know, we understand we're not going to have a meaningful political voice, but the economy is going to grow. We're going to live better. And he delivered. And that was the basis for regime legitimacy. When Putin came back to the presidency in 2012, though, the economic picture was very different. And he didn't talk about the economy. He talked about Russia's a great power, Russian nationalism, Russia reasserting itself on the world stage, and that narrative to some extent required an adversary, and the United States and the West fit that bill. But looking at the economics, it's hard to see a course change initiated by the Kremlin. And that's because to open the economy up likely requires also opening up the political scene, which the Kremlin is not prepared to do. And you can see some of the limitations. The one I cite is Skolkovo. 12 years ago, Skolkovo was announced by great fanfare by then President Medvedev, and it was going to be Russia's Silicon Valley. And they invested billions of dollars. Skolkovo, it's just southwest of Moscow. They built the physical plant. And 12 years ago, I don't think many of you have heard of Skolkovo. It hasn't done that. And it's not because there are not smart Russians in the IT world. There's 15,000 of them working up in Silicon Valley. But Skolkovo didn't have the surrounding infrastructure. Rule of law, contract law, patent protections, the chance if you had a legal suit to go into a court and have a chance of a real fair outcome. That's not there. They don't have the financial infrastructure. There's no idea of venture capitalism where that's a great idea, here's $20 million, go build the next Google. And so the lack of that infrastructure, which I don't believe the Kremlin can create, is responsible for the fact that Skolkovo really hasn't made much progress. The other thing I think that holds the Russian economy back is, well, let me take a survey here. How many people in this room, raise your hand if you have a cell phone or a computer or clothes or a car or office furniture or home furniture that was made in Russia? Okay, I count one hand, or 2 hands raised by the same person. Russia's problem, I think, economically is it doesn't make much that the world wants to buy. Most of Russian exports are things that come out of the ground: oil, gas, gold, timber. And Vladimir Putin seems to be very happy with that model. And I kind of have to question that, because if you look at that economic model, particularly at a time when Europe, which is the biggest consumer of Russian oil and gas, is now trying to move very quickly towards renewables, and it just doesn't seem that that's going to be a formula for economic success in the coming decade. Another complicating factor that Russia faces is demographics. The Russian population is declining. It's about 145 million now. The UN estimate is it'll be between 128 and 135 million in 2050. But you're already seeing the impact. The numbers now in the active labor force are going down each year. As Vladimir Putin is discovering right now, also the number of young men who can be drafted into the army. So the number of men who turn eligible, that's age 17, for the draft in Russia, today is half of what it was in 2006. That's going to be a limitation on Russian ambitions. Now, this is one thing with those demographics. One thing that's been a surprise for me is when you look at how the Kremlin has compressed the political space in Russia, the one thing that they've left open is immigration. It's very easy to leave Russia. And several million people have left Russia over the last 15 years. They tend to be young people, productive, energetic. There's been a surge in immigration in the last 2 months when the war broke out. And at the last count I saw, the estimate that 50,000 IT workers left Russia. And this is interesting to me. And I look at these things and I say, Russia is not 10 feet tall. Now, they still have enough. They're not going to disappear. They're still going to be a challenge. They still have an economy that supports a fairly large military, although that military's performance, I think, has raised some questions. But also, I think Vladimir Putin, he has played a weak hand fairly well. But I don't see him as a long-term strategist. I think he's more a tactician. And he takes a short-term view, because decisions that are being made now by Putin and the Kremlin in terms of the economy and things like that, I think are going to leave his successor 10 years down the road facing a much more difficult situation. And that's because thoughts are not being given to what happens in the long term. So when the Biden administration took office in 2021, I think when they recognized the relationship with Russia was going to be largely adversarial. They recognized that they were going to have to push back, but they were also prepared to say on some areas where American and Russian interests overlap, we can cooperate. And you saw that early on the first full day in office, the Biden administration said, we agree, we're going to extend the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty to 2026. And that was done in February of 2021. And in last spring, the administration articulated the goal. They said, we want to have a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. And that seemed like the right goal. The problem was, I think in Vladimir Putin, you have somebody who wants instability and wants to be unpredictable. And so that complicates things. There was last June, the meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin. And although there were no big breakthroughs, it seemed actually, they defined an agenda. And had we been having this conversation, say, last October, I would have said, well, you know, since June, in the last 4 months, there's actually been some progress. You've seen a reactivation of diplomatic channels that had not been working for several years. In the strategic stability dialogue, which is looking at things like nuclear arms control and related issues such as missile defense, they hadn't yet got to a point where we're not launching a negotiation. But both sides were saying, these discussions, they're constructive, they're useful. And even on cyber, people in Washington are saying, we think the Russians have been more restrained on the cyber world. Now, that's all been wiped out by my next topic, which is Russia's war against Ukraine. I think the war has its roots really back in 2013. Ironically, back in 2013, Russia had a neutral Ukrainian neighbor. It was in Ukraine's law that Ukraine would have non-bloc status. President Yanukovych at the time said, I'm not interested in joining NATO. And the Ukrainian public was not interested in joining NATO. But what they were interested in was drawing closer to the European Union. So in November of 2013, Ukraine was on the verge of signing an association agreement with the European Union, which would have created a free trade area customs union and would have had Ukraine basically adjust a number of its laws to be consistent with EU standards. That was popular in Ukraine. And a week before the signing of the association agreement, in the face of a lot of Russian pressure, threats of economic sanctions, but also some carrots, offers of billion-dollar loans with no interest, Yanukovych basically succumbed to the Russian pressure and refused to sign. That night, the Maidan Revolution began. It started as a revolution that was pro-EU. It then morphed into a revolution that was much more, or protests that were much more anti the authoritarianism that Yanukovych had brought to Ukraine. That played out over 2.5 months. There was violence. An agreement was brokered between Yanukovych and opposition leaders after the violence. I don't think that the opposition leaders could have sold that agreement to the people in the streets. But they really didn't have a chance because Yanukovych signed it and then disappeared. And the next day, and this was a thing, my guess is the next day that Ukraine's Rada, that's their parliament, they probably didn't check every box of the Constitution on this when they appointed an acting president and acting prime minister. But the Constitution of Ukraine says this is what you do if the president dies in office or is impeached. It doesn't say what you do if he just disappears. So I think they made the right political decision. And the acting prime minister, the acting president said, our number one goal is to sign the association agreement and bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. That caused the Kremlin to panic. You saw the Russian military, Ukrainians referred to them as little green men. They were wearing Russian combat fatigues, clearly professional soldiers by the way they handled their weapons, but all of their identifying patches have been removed. They seized Crimea. The Russians then organized a bogus referendum, and it was bogus in many ways, but I'll describe just one, is the referendum gave the people of Crimea a choice, or two choices. Box number one was, do you want Crimea to join Russia? Box number two was, do you want Crimea to revert to an early 1990s constitution, which was replaced after 6 or 7 months? That would have given Crimea almost independent status. Now, if you were happy with Crimea as a part of Ukraine under the constitutional regulations of 2014, there was no box to check. So the referendum was conducted. I think the numbers were grossly inflated, and Russia basically annexes Crimea. Now, part of that was there was actually about 12,000 Ukrainian military personnel in Crimea. Kyiv chose not to fight. And I think part of that was they wanted, if there was any fighting, to be clear, it was the Russians that started it. But then a month later, these little green men show up in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And then the Ukrainians do resist. At first, this is described as a separatist struggle, but it's pretty clear early on that leadership's coming from Moscow, money's coming from Moscow. The so-called separatists say, we get our heavy weapons, we captured them from the Ukrainians. But you begin to see things like types of tanks that were never in the Ukrainian inventory. And that leads to a conflict, really, I think, with Russian and Russian proxy forces. The Ukrainians do choose to oppose this. And despite a couple of tries to find a settlement, that conflict never really ends. It simmers. And over the course of about 8 years, 14,000 people are killed in that conflict. And that was before the invasion began in February. So that's in early 2021, when people would look at Ukraine, the expectation was, we don't see what happens next. This conflict that's been simmering for 8 years, it could simmer for another 5 or 6 years. It seems like the Kremlin is content with using that as leverage on Kyiv. But then last April, about a year ago, you saw a fairly large Russian military buildup take place in the context of exercises around Ukraine. And there were concerns, are the Russians going to do something? And the Russians didn't. In May, they basically say the exercises are done, the troops leave, but a lot of the equipment stays behind. And then in November, you begin to see, again, more equipment coming in, the troops coming back, such that by the beginning of February, there were an estimated 125 Russian battalion tactical groups around Ukraine. That's out of a total Russian army force of about 170, so about 3/4 of their battalion tactical groups and 50 to 60% of Russian ground personnel arrayed against Ukraine. In December, Putin began to demand security guarantees for Russia. The demands were that NATO forswear any further enlargement and that NATO withdraw the relatively small forces it placed on NATO territory, on the territory of those countries that had joined the alliance after 1997. And people were looking at, okay, is this really an opening bid in a real give and take negotiation? Or as I think it turned out to be, it was basically put forward with the desire to get it rejected to become one more grievance in the list of the grievances that the Russians had when they launched the war. Now, the United States and NATO responded, we're not going to go by those things, but in your draft agreements, because the Russians proposed some draft agreements, there's some arms control measures, risk reduction measures. There are some things that we can do, and we know how to do this. We did them in the 80s and the 90s that could actually make a real contribution to European security. And they could also improve Russian security. The Russians were not interested in those things. And so I think really if you look why the Russians go to war, I would say there were really 3 factors behind it. One was a geopolitical concern, and this was not just about NATO, but about Ukraine's relationship with the European Union. In Moscow, they wanted Ukraine back in the Russian sphere of influence. At the beginning of this year, they saw that Ukraine was moving perhaps irretrievably out of that sphere towards the West. And I would argue the ironic thing here is nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than Russian policy and actions of the past 8 years. The seizure of Crimea, the conflict in Donbass, the killing of 14,000 Ukrainians. So 10 years ago, in 2012 or 2013, had you done a poll in Ukraine and said, asked Ukrainians, should Ukraine be a member of NATO? 15% might have said yes. In January, it was 58 to 62% saying yes. And I think, again, that's a result of Russian policy. To the extent Russia was trying to bring, and the Kremlin was trying to bring Ukraine back towards Russia, it was a massive strategic fail. There's a second concern, though, a second factor here, and that's probably as important, if not more important, than the geopolitical factor. And that's Russian domestic politics. And that is that for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful Ukraine is a nightmare. Because that kind of Ukraine gets ordinary Russians to say, why can't we have the political voice, the same democracy rights that they have in Ukraine? And remember, job number 1 for the Kremlin is regime preservation. And then the third factor is Vladimir Putin. He wrote a lengthy essay last summer about Ukraine. On February 21, 3 days before the invasion, he gave an hour speech, mainly on Ukraine. And you look at that, and here's somebody who basically denies Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign state, who presents a very distorted history of Ukraine that few historians would recognize. And I mean, Russia and Ukraine, just for context, these are 2 countries, culture, language, history, religion, it's thoroughly intertwined. It goes back 1,000 years. Both claim the Kievan Rus in the 10th century as their founding state. But for all of that, in 1991, there was a referendum in Ukraine, and 90+% of the population voted for independence. That was in every part of Ukraine. There's only one part of Ukraine where ethnic Russians constitute a majority, that's Crimea, and over 50% of the people in Crimea voted for independence. And for Russians, I think that was hard to lose. I mean, of all the pieces they lost when the Soviet Union collapsed, losing Ukraine was the hardest. And I remember a conversation back in the 90s. We were working with a Russian deputy foreign minister. This guy was a good guy to work with. We got a lot of things accomplished in U.S.-Russia relations. But one day we were talking about Ukraine, and he says, up here in my head, I understand Ukraine's an independent state. Here in my heart, it's going to take a while to get used to that. And I don't think Vladimir Putin ever became used to that. The other comment I would make about this war is it's a war of choice. Ukraine posed no security threat to Russia. The Russian military, in terms of active duty personnel, was 4 times larger than the Ukrainian military. Typically, the Russian defense budget was 10 times what the Ukrainians spent on defense. And Russia has 4,400 nuclear weapons. Ukraine has 0. 30 years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had on its territory the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. And the Ukrainians gave that up. And they chose to give that up in large part because in 1994, Russia said, we will commit to respect your territorial integrity and your sovereignty. We will commit not to use force or threaten to use force against you. Of course, commitments that have now been totally shredded. So we are now in week 10 of this war, and it's pretty clear the Russian military is not succeeding. If you look at the attack vectors on the first day, I mean, there were really sort of 4 axes of attack into Ukraine, coming from the north, south, and east. The general interpretation was the number 1 Russian goal was to take the capital of Kyiv, depose the government, but also it really looked like the Russian forces were trying to secure and capture perhaps the eastern two-thirds of Ukraine. And they completely failed to achieve that. Around Kyiv, they were beaten back. Pretty significant personnel and equipment losses. The British estimate now is that there have been more than 15,000 Russian soldiers killed in action in Ukraine. And if you assume 1 to 2 wounded for every soldier killed in action, you're talking about perhaps 20 to 25% of the original invading force has now been casualties of this war. Failing to take Kyiv at the end of March, the Russians basically withdrew from Kyiv. They withdrew from northern Ukraine. Other places where they failed, Kharkiv, the 2nd largest city in Ukraine, a city that was predominantly Russian-speaking, 25 miles from the Russian border, it's still in Ukrainian hands, despite being under attack for 8 weeks. Odessa, which was clearly in the south on the Black Sea, there was a Russian advance headed in that direction. It's basically been bogged down for 6 or 7 weeks. And what the Russians have been doing for the last 3 weeks, and you're now beginning to see it happen, is they've reoriented they massed their forces to try to take Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. And actually, if you go back to February 24, that was one of the original war aims that Putin announced in his speech. So I think there's a recognition on the part of the Kremlin they cannot achieve the original goals. There's also a little bit of a sense of desperation, though, that they're looking for something they can call a victory. So you might have seen last Thursday, they in effect said, we've taken Mariupol, this city that has been bombarded and shelled now for 9 weeks. And so the Russians have claimed victory there, despite the fact that by Russian count, there are still 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers holding out, fighting against them in Mariupol. Mariupol, I think, is really kind of one of the tragic ironies of this. It has been besieged by the Russian army. In Mariupol, more than 90% of the population spoke Russian as their first language, and ethnic Russians were almost half the city's population. So I think what you've seen in this war is a series of Russian or Kremlin miscalculations. The first one was, and this is astonishing to me, I don't think the Kremlin or the Russian general staff thought the Ukrainians would fight. If you look at the pattern of attack on Kyiv, it's almost like they expected this would be a 3 or 4 day war. And in fact, the Ukrainians have said that in one of the convoys they destroyed, they found boxes of dress uniforms, which they surmised were for the victory parade in Kyiv, which never happened. This astounds me because had you asked me or any Western expert on Ukraine, we would have said the Ukrainians will fight. Now, I would not have predicted they would have been as effective as they would, but there was no doubt in my mind, and I was in Kyiv on January 30 and 31, And when you would talk to Ukrainians who were not connected to the military, and you say, if the Russians invade, the common answer was, I'm going to join the Territorial Defense Forces, get an AK-47 and defend my country. And that seems to have completely surprised the Russians. A second thing where I think the Russians miscalculated is they way overestimated Russian military capabilities. Now, after the Russian-Georgia War in 2008, the Kremlin pumped a lot of money in the last 15 years into building up the Russian military, hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think we're finding out now just how bad corruption was. A lot of cable they bought didn't go to buying military stuff. So in one thing, they bought 60,000 tactical radios for encrypted communications, apparently none of which work. Their precision-guided weapons apparently miss the target 50 to 60% of the time. And you don't see many of those weapons. I mean, the Russians are dropping a lot of dumb bombs, which actually is one reason why the Ukrainians are shooting down so many Russian planes, is because they have to stay low to hit the targets. A third miscalculation was the strength of the Western reaction. It was in a couple of ways. They thought, I think, NATO was going to be fairly divided. In fact, NATO came together pretty quickly. NATO has basically now reinforced military presence on the eastern flank. In terms of arming Ukraine, most NATO members are now contributing. In fact, there are now 35 to 40 countries around the world that are providing defensive assistance or weapons to Ukraine. And this is one of those things where unintended consequences, Finland and Sweden, both of which have been neutral for decades, will, I believe, within the next 8 weeks, formally apply to join NATO, because they have considered that is important for their security interests. The other thing that the Russians did not predict was how robust Western sanctions would be. And just two examples. One was the decision to basically shut down all high-tech exports. And that's having an impact. Moscow's mayor last week said he expects to lose 200,000 jobs in the city in the coming weeks as factories shut down. Automobile factories are shutting down because they don't have the chips to run the computers that are now so populated in our cars. And there's one report which I'll throw out. I haven't yet been able to confirm it, but it says that the Russian main factory for producing tanks has shut down because it no longer has the semiconductors that they use to operate the tanks. That's going to have a big impact for the Russian economy. The other thing that I think caught the Russians short was that the West decided to sanction the Russian central bank. One thing that Vladimir Putin has been doing for years is building up foreign reserves. That was going to get him through any Western sanctions. So he had that in February 1, $630 billion in foreign reserves in the Russian central bank. Great number. Only one problem, 50 to 60% of those reserves were in Western financial institutions. They've all now been frozen and are not accessible to the Russians. And much of the rest of the foreign reserves that the Russians have are gold, and basically the West has put in rules that make it very difficult now to buy Russian gold. So these things are going to have an impact. Already you see week-on-week inflation in Russia accelerating. It's heading for double digits, maybe by 20% in a few months. And the prediction of the World Bank is that the Russian economy this year will contract by 11%. The head of the Russian central bank today said she expects it to contract between 8 and 10%. So there's some pretty heavy economic pain coming for Russia. Now there is one loophole there, and I'll talk about it in a moment, is oil and gas. That's still coming, and that's still generating revenue for the Russians, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But why these miscalculations? I think this gets back to that very tight inner circle that Putin operates in. I don't think he gets a wide range of views. It's an echo chamber, and my guess is there are not a lot of people who are prepared to give him bad news. And that inner circle, which was pretty closed, from appearances has become even more closed the past 2 years because paranoia on the part of, I think, Putin about COVID. I mean, he meets with his generals sometimes 30 feet away, although presumably they've been all vaccinated. And I also think that Putin has changed a bit. He seems to be more emotional now, more angry, and that may cloud his calculation of costs and benefits. And among other things, this was a guy who was prepared to take risks, but measured risks. But he's taking big risks now. And if you look at, Russia certainly had the largest conventional army in Europe, but Ukraine is the size of Texas. That's a lot of territory to take. Now, there may be a possibility of a negotiation at some point. I actually look at President Zelensky. I think he wants to negotiate. I think he would like to find a way to end the fighting because, by all appearances, it truly pains him that every day more Ukrainians are dying. And he's made a couple of offers, I think, that are designed to sort of find some middle ground. For example, He said, we are prepared to set aside our ambitions to join NATO. We are prepared to accept neutrality, and we'll have no foreign bases on our territory. Now, he wants some guarantees, which could be tricky, but that's a step towards the Russians. And on Crimea, he said, we will agree not to take Crimea back by force, and we'll settle it in 15 years. And I wonder, my guess is most Ukrainians understand that Ukraine does not have the leverage to get Crimea back. But it's politically very hard for a president to go out and say, now, I'm going to acknowledge Crimea is Russian. That 15-year period, though, might be a device, and this is just my surmise, that you can do it now, and 15 years later, the president of Ukraine, who will not be Zelensky, can say, I really hate to do it, but this guy Zelensky committed us to do this. And that might be a way to acknowledge that would be not as politically painful as it could be. But so far, the Russians seem to be too pig-headed to put that idea up. But the problem, I think the basic problem is, at this point in time, the Russians don't seem prepared to negotiate seriously. They still have some pretty maximalist demands. And I think Putin still hopes to win this on the battlefield. Just one last thing on the negotiations. My view is that the West, the United States, we should follow the Ukrainians' lead on this. Because if there is a negotiation, and that's still an if question, Zelensky and his government are going to have to calculate, we want to save Ukrainian lives. There are certain positions of principle we have to protect. We may have to make some concessions. Those concessions could be politically very difficult with a population whose attitude towards Russia has hardened in the last couple of months. We can't tell Zelensky how to make that choice. He's got to make that choice. And that means the West shouldn't push him to take a bad deal. But also, if Zelensky says, I have a deal that satisfies Ukraine's interests, then the West shouldn't be saying no to that. So just the last couple of comments, where's this thing going? A month ago, I would sketch out 3 scenarios. And I'll give you all 3, but I'll tell you I only think 2 of them are really likely. One is that the Kremlin concludes that the cost of this misadventure, in terms of dead Russian soldiers, destroyed Russian equipment, damage to the Russian military reputation, the sanctions, the political isolation, reach the point where somebody in the Kremlin, either Putin or some other group, says, we have to find a way out. And we have to, maybe we can declare victory in some way, but we need to get a real negotiation. We need to end this. I don't think that's likely in the near term. There's certainly been no sign that in the Kremlin they're prepared to do that. The second scenario, which again I would have said 5 or 6 weeks ago, but I don't think it's possible now, is that what happens if the Russians actually win? If they take Kyiv, if they defeat the Ukrainian army. And I don't describe this as a viable scenario now because the Russians, I think, have shown they cannot do that. That's beyond their Russian military capabilities. But let's suppose for a moment, had they done that, and they would have put then in place in Kyiv a pro-Russian government. That pro-Russian government could not survive for 2 minutes after the departure of the Russian military. So that victory, and I would put it in quotation marks, would mean a year's or more likely decades-long Russian occupation of Ukraine or 2/3 of Ukraine with a hostile, nationalist, angry population, many of whom would be armed, and there would be armed resistance. It would mean political isolation, and it would mean continued Western sanctions. So I have a hard time, and this is where I have a hard time thinking through. I mean, that was, when I look at the scenarios, that's like the best scenario for Putin and the Kremlin. And it looks to me like that would be a loser of a scenario. But I think where we are now is most likely is probably for some time to come military stalemate. People are now saying that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, if the Russians can't win it, then they're just going to run out of steam. That they'll just lose the ability to conduct coherent offensive operations. And then you may get into this thing where the 2 armies are just slugging it out, but neither side able to make a breakthrough. And that may be more likely for some time to come. I think the assessment now in Washington is that this war is going to drag on for months. It has raised the question that people were not asking 5 weeks ago, which is, could Ukraine win this? And I'm not prepared to say that Ukraine can win militarily, but I think it's a lot more likely now than it was 5 or 6 weeks ago. Can they drive the Russians out completely? 5 or 6 weeks ago I said, I don't think so. Now I don't exclude that. Now, just a couple comments on the Biden administration. I think they have done the policy about right. I give them really high marks on the diplomacy. They have spent thousands and thousands of hours in meetings and phone calls and contacts with Europe and other allies, and they've really succeeded in forging a united NATO view. It's not just the United States, it's now 35 countries around the world contributing to the defense capabilities of Ukraine, and they put together a sanctions package that not only surprised the Kremlin, but I think it also surprised a number of the countries who ended up agreeing to it. There is one clear red line that the president has drawn and that NATO countries have drawn is they're not prepared to send American or NATO troops to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine. But short of that, they're prepared to find a lot of military equipment. Next steps, I think there are really two things. We need to continue the flow of weapons to Ukraine. During the first couple of weeks of the war, the premium was on getting the Ukrainians things like Stingers and Javelins, which can be, you don't require a lot of training, they can be used fairly easily. And then legacy Soviet equipment, S-300 anti-aircraft missiles, things that were still in the inventory of some Central European countries from their Warsaw Pact times, things that the Ukrainians knew how to use. But I believe that as the assessment in Washington has become that this is a war that could last months, there's now saying, okay, we can begin to provide more sophisticated equipment, even though it will take some time to train the Ukrainians how to use it. And you've already, for example, now seen the United States providing, I think it's like 90 artillery pieces, heavy artillery pieces and artillery rounds. The Germans providing heavy anti-aircraft weapons. I think the British are now talking about providing tanks. Weapons that will require some training, but will give the Ukrainian military much better capabilities. And then I think looking at ways to tighten the sanctions. And here the big question is, what do we do about oil and gas coming to Europe? Now, the United States, 8 weeks ago, we embargoed Russian oil and gas. Gas was easy. We import no gas from Russia, and we got only about 3% of our oil from Russia. So that was pretty easy for us to do. And I have some empathy for European countries who are getting 20, 30, 40% of their oil and gas from Russia. But that also means that there's a lot of money going to Russia. So the question is, it's going to take them a while to reduce that dependency, but maybe we ought to focus less on reducing the energy flows from Russia to Europe, and can we focus on reducing the flow of revenues back? So one idea that's out there that I think people are beginning to think through is, could you, for example, slap a high tariff, 60% or 70% on Russian oil, and basically make it to the point where if the Russians want their oil to remain competitive, they would have to reduce the price they charge. And that at least would cut the amount of money that's going to Russia for their oil sales. But I think in all of this, the goal of the West should be to raise the cost to Russia and help the Ukrainians persuade the Kremlin that they cannot win this war. Ideally, at the end of the day, the Russians withdraw their military from Ukraine, or at least to where they were prior to February 24, or at a minimum, that they negotiate a settlement on terms that would be acceptable to Kyiv. I think it's very much in the American and the West interest that Russia fail and that Ukraine prevail. And as I said, either drive the Russians out or get an agreement that would be acceptable in Kyiv. So at that point, let me stop, and I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, so again, Liz will be around with the microphone, get her attention, and we've got a lot of people here, so one question per person. Thank you very much.
How about nuclear blackmail by Russia?
Not yet.
Wait your turn, please.
I'm going to start us off. What do you make of the Russian decision to bomb Kyiv while the UN Secretary General was in the city?
There was a message there, and I hope the UN Secretary. But this is again where, I spent a couple of years in Russia. I've studied Russia, and I don't understand sometimes. Why would you do that? I mean, Guterres is somebody that at some point you might want to have on your side. He could be helpful. But what was the message to Guterres from that? And I don't understand that Russian decision, but it seems to be of a piece with some of the things that the Russians have done, which I look at and say, this seems to be counterproductive.
Hi. Would you comment on the Russia-China axis that has developed as a result of this war?
Yeah. Well, I think the Russia-China axis was already developing for a variety of reasons. It's interesting to me that when you look at China, China has refused to condemn Russia. Even though for China, given their view of Taiwan, the idea of Russian annexation of Crimea, which China has never recognized, or Russia's recognition of the two so-called People's Republics in Donbass as independent states, that's anathema to the Chinese. The Chinese thus far, though, try very hard not to criticize Russia, but I don't think they're doing much to help Russia. So, and we saw this already in 2014 when there were Western financial sanctions imposed on Russia after the Russians seized Crimea and then got involved in the conflict in Donbass. Russian banks looked to the Chinese banks for financing. And the Chinese really gave them the cold shoulder, I think for two reasons. One is they didn't see very good investments in Russia. But second, Chinese banks were concerned that if they began to lend to Russia to help Russia to get around the Western sanctions, that Chinese banks could be targeted. And my guess is that in private exchanges, that's been dropped to the Chinese, that if you begin to overtly help the Russians get around these sanctions, then you could become the target of secondary sanctions. So China's trying to find that fine line there. But my guess is at this point in time, the Russians are not getting a lot of help from the Chinese.
What is so special about the Donbass and Crimea that they made their move on them in 2014?
Yeah. Well, Crimea, I mean, as I said, Crimea was the only part of Ukraine where ethnic Russians were a majority. Crimea also, it was the home for a good part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet by agreement with Ukraine, and there were like 15,000 Russian naval and military personnel in Crimea. And Crimea, in Soviet times, think of Crimea as kind of Arizona and Florida. That's where people who had the money went to retire. Because in the Soviet Union, that's where you had a nice climate. So and also, I mean, Crimea was originally, I mean, it was colonized by Catherine the Great. Sevastopol, the main city in Crimea, was founded to be the home port for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And Crimea was actually part of Russia until 1954, when it was transferred administratively to Ukraine. And so I think that's part of it. In Donbass, again, Donbass, if you look at that area, ethnic Ukrainians were still a majority, but that was still a population that tended to have more ethnic Russians than elsewhere in Ukraine and had more economic connections. And at least in Soviet times, Donbass was actually probably one of the richer areas of the Soviet Union because of the industry. The times I visited there when I was in Ukraine in the late 1990s, though, a lot of that industry was getting pretty worn down. It was pretty much dinosaur industry. But I think those two areas there, they've had an attraction to the Russians because of the population. Now, and this is one of the tricky things is, my guess is there are a number of Ukrainians who think, maybe we can let those areas go. I remember in 2014 talking to a pretty senior Ukrainian official who said, maybe we ought to let Crimea and Donbass go. He said, Donbass, they don't think like us. And politically, if you take Crimea and Donbass out, you remove probably 3 to 4 million voters who tend to be pro-Russian. And it makes the political entity a lot more consolidated. But having said that, every Ukrainian I've talked to, they say, yeah, it might be. I said, but just politically, nobody can come out and say we're prepared to give those up at this point. And even on Donbass, it was interesting when the Ukrainians made their proposal for how to settle this conflict on Donbass. The one thing they said is, we can't give you a proposal. Zelensky and Putin have to meet personally to sort that one out.
Yes. What are the chances that Russia, in despair, really not being in this situation, to extend the war to another country, including a NATO country?
Yeah. I actually think the prospects of that are pretty low. Because one, you now have probably 60% of Russian ground forces now tied up in Ukraine. Either in Ukraine or they're basically recovering because they got so badly mauled in the first few weeks of the war. And my guess is if you're sitting there in Moscow and thinking about, NATO, do you really want to take NATO on at this point in time? And my guess is that would not be a smart proposition. Because NATO would have NATO would have fought this war in a very different way than the Ukrainians have, because NATO has different capabilities. So we all read about that miles-long convoy that was strung out north of Kyiv for about 3 weeks. In a conflict with NATO, that convoy would have been, history after about 2 or 3 days. And that just because NATO has capability that the Ukrainians don't. So I don't worry about that. There was, I think, a little bit of concern about Moldova, because a Russian general a week and a half ago said, well, we're going to take eastern Ukraine and then southern Ukraine, and then we would be in a position perhaps to take to Moldova if the leadership wants it. But my guess is that even that at this point in time, if you're sitting in the Kremlin and you're looking at how the Russian military thus far has underperformed, my guess is you're thinking, we have to finish something that we can call a victory in Ukraine before we start looking at, extending our ambitions elsewhere.
You've referred to the weakness of the Russian military.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to why Putin hasn't resorted to cyber warfare,
Yeah.
especially against NATO.
Yeah, I think part of the answer he has, but also because this is a good. I think almost in every Ukraine conversation I've been in the last 6 weeks, that's been the question. And one person who knows a lot more about cyber than I do said he thought there were a couple reasons. One, he said there are right now working with Ukraine a lot of very smart people, and he said both U.S. government but also from high-tech industry working with the Ukrainians to help them protect against Russian attacks. The other observation he made is that a lot of times, with a cyber attack, once you use it, you expose it, and then the other side can figure it out how to beat it, and then perhaps use it back against you. But he said a lot of these cyber attacks, he said in the case of solar wind, when they looked at it, it took the Russians about 2 years to plan solar wind. And so his thought was, because the Russians kept, or at least the Kremlin kept this invasion date really, really close held. Soldiers that were captured by the Ukrainians were told, where they said, we were told we're going on exercises in Belarus, and then at 11 o'clock at night, we're told to assemble, get your kit, we're going into Ukraine at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so the question was, maybe the cyber guys didn't get the heads up, so that kind of preparation that they need to prepare for the cyber attacks, they never had the chance to do it. And as for no cyber attacks in NATO, or less, I think there are cyber attacks, but there's been a lot of effort, I believe, in the last 4 or 5 years in the West put in to try to fortify our systems to make them more resilient. My guess is, and because the U.S. government does not talk about this so much, is I suspect we have some fairly serious offensive cyber capabilities of our own, and that may be a factor in the Russians' restraint, understanding that we can do some pretty nasty things to them in the cyber world. But those are my best guesses on this. But that has been a surprise, is that we've not seen more of the cyber domain in this fight.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador, for coming today. I think we enlightened everybody. When I watch TV, as I did this morning, I am saddened in tears in what's going on over there. Yeah. People are getting killed, people are getting raped, and we have to do something about it, and I think we're doing something about it. We have special forces that could go in there and kill that guy and all of his buddies in a skinny minute. And you talked about cyber warfare. I worked for Snap-on Tools, drove a truck around town for 10 years. Snap-on Tools is a Fortune 500 company. They got cyber hacked. They cost a lot of money. They paid off. Guess who did the cybering? Russia. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, do we have the capabilities to go in there like we did with Saddam Hussein? We should have done it with Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and Toto, and stop all this killing over there. I'm saddened by all the people that are killed over there every day. They don't. If they have a glass of water, it's a big day for them.
Yeah. First, I understand. How you feel about this. My wife and I watch on the news and we say, oh, that place just got bombed. We visited there once. We have friends in Ukraine who are either now no longer living in Ukraine, who have evacuated or have evacuated their kids. But I think what you're talking about is you have to ask, are you prepared to go to war with Russia? And that would be a nuclear war. And over very quickly. Well, the nuclear war, you may be right in one sense. The nuclear war could be over very quickly, but I think the United States and Russia would be in very different shape afterwards. And it would, both would be pretty devastated. And I think that's why the president has chosen to draw that line. Is I think there have been what I call tacit rules. There's certain rules of the game that have evolved between the West and Russia on this. And one is that it's kosher under those rules for the West to provide weapons to Ukraine. I think we're not quite sure how high on the scale that goes, and the debate that took place about 5 weeks ago over the MiG-29s, I think there was a little bit of uncertainty. Were the MiG-29s okay, or were they beyond the pale? Now, I also think it was a mistake. The West talked too much about the MiG-29s. They just sort of shown up in Ukraine. But I think the red line that's drawn is because if you do have American forces, go in there, or NATO forces go in there, or if there's that kind of attack to try to get Putin, you got to be prepared for a full-scale war with Russia.
Oh, this is completely different. But I was wondering about food for the people in Ukraine. Are they having problems getting food to feed their people and medications?
Yeah. I think in some areas, like Mariupol, there's a very dire situation in Mariupol. And that's the city that's been besieged by the Russian military now for 8 weeks. And probably about 2/3 of the population has been evacuated from Mariupol, but there's still a lot of civilians and military people there. And it's pretty difficult there. Elsewhere, there seems to be a fairly good assistance effort on the humanitarian side that I don't think there's a food problem yet in most Ukrainian cities. Bear in mind, though, Ukraine, which had a population of about 45 million, there are probably 5 million who now are refugees. They've left Ukraine. About half of that population is in Poland, Romania, Slovakia. Some are now in Germany. And I think they very much want to return back, but they're waiting for things to settle down. And then there are a number, maybe another equal number, who are internally displaced within Ukraine that have largely left eastern Ukraine and central Ukraine to the west. Although it's interesting what I've seen reports from the Ukrainians that over the last couple of weeks, that the number of Ukrainians coming back from Poland into Ukraine is far outnumbers the number who are going from Ukraine into Poland, which suggests that some portion of that population is now returning to places like Kyiv, now that Kyiv is no longer under immediate Russian threat.
One advantage that the Russians enjoy is that they have long-range missiles so that they can destroy the cities of Russia. What do you think about supplying them with long-range missiles? The U.S. is supplying them.
Yeah, well, the first thing is we actually, in terms of surface-to-surface missiles, we actually don't have that much right now in that kind of range category. I mean, we have intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we have some missiles with a range of maybe 300 miles yet, but we actually haven't begun building missiles because from, let's see, 1988 until I think 2018, there was the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, where the United States and Russia were prohibited from having missiles with a range of between 300 and 3,300 kilometers. The kinds of missiles that we do have, air-launched cruise missiles and such, I mean, we'd have to not only train the Ukrainians how to use those, but we'd have to figure out a way to give them B-52 bombers. And that gets to a level of sophistication which just really doesn't work. So I think that's what an imbalance there that we probably can't rectify in the immediate future. But one thing that's been interesting is, and I find it, again, it says a strange thing about the Russian psyche, is the Ukrainians have mounted several attacks into Russia. The first one was carried out by a couple of helicopter gunships, and they've attacked oil refineries and oil storage areas close to Ukraine. Those are clearly military targets because those are providing the diesel fuel that are powering Russian tanks, and they've attacked a couple of ammo dumps, it looks like. And the really strange thing about this is the Russians' expression of outrage, and it comes from the Ministry of Defense, and it comes from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, like, how can the Ukrainians do this? And you're going, really? I mean, Russia is indiscriminately bombing and shelling cities throughout Ukraine. And somehow the rules of this war are such that Ukraine is prohibited from striking military targets in Russia. You heard something about the Moskva, the Russian cruiser that the Ukrainians sank. How could they do this? It's a military vessel. It's been firing missiles into Ukraine for the last 4 weeks. Why would you think that the Ukrainians would not try to hit it if they could? But it's one of the stranger episodes of the last of this war is this Russian expectation that what they do to Ukraine is fair, but any payback is beyond the pale.
Dr. Pifer, I would want to ask you about your opening remarks when you spoke about how sensitive Putin is to Russia's position. And seeing as how he's in Ukraine, his goal was obviously to take over the country and make him a neutral, and isn't doing well at all. And now perhaps looking for a feeling, enclosed as he is and maybe irrational as autocrats can be. And then our Secretary of Defense says our goal in there is to diminish Russia's capability so they can't do this kind of stuff again. I find that objectionable that they would, you're throwing fuel on the fire. He's already hyper, and now you've just told him you want to make him, want to cut his knees off, cut him off at the knees.
Yeah, you might have chosen different words, although again, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do. I mean, we're providing weapons to Ukraine, and if there's ever a settlement and this war ends, I think one of the Ukrainians talk about security guarantees, and what they seem to want is the United States and other Western countries to guarantee that if there's ever a Russian violation of Ukrainian neutrality, that we will send military forces to defend Ukraine. I don't think the Ukrainians can get that. I'm not sure the Biden administration would be prepared to offer that. Second, that would be in a treaty that would require 2/3 of the Senate to consent to ratification. I'm not sure the U.S. Senate would consent to commit now to a future American war against Russia. And third, even if we did those two things, and Donald Trump is president in 2024, that's not going to stop him. My argument to the Ukrainians has been, your security guarantee should be as you need to maintain a strong military, and the guarantees that you want from the West are not that they will come to save you, but that they will help you modernize your military so it's sufficient to make sure that the Russians will never do this again. But again, if you're going to see the Russians driven out of Ukraine, weakening the Russian military is part of the objective. And it gets into the longer term thing in the same way that I think, again, my guess is some of my former colleagues at the State Department kind of went when the president said Vladimir Putin's a war criminal, and it would be great if he was gone. I agree. I mean, I don't think the United States has the ability, and we shouldn't make our policy aimed at regime change in the Kremlin, because we're not smart enough to figure out how the Kremlin works. But as a statement of fact, yeah, I think life is going to be a lot easier for Ukrainians and maybe for us if there's somebody in the Kremlin other than Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, we might be a little bit more diplomatic, but again, I'm not sure how much that affects how the Russians look at us.
Thank you. Now, thinking about Russian domestic politics and some of the rationalizations and justifications for the operation in Ukraine, could you comment on Putin's relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church and how that relationship has evolved over time?
Basically, I would say the Russian Orthodox Church, or at least its leadership, is basically an arm of the Russian government and the Kremlin. The Patriarch Kirill, who heads the Russian Orthodox Church, he's basically out there as a cheerleader for this war. I think he's been subverted. You do have to have some questions about the Patriarch. I don't know if you saw the picture a few years back, but they actually tried to etch it out, but he was wearing a watch that was $50,000 watch. And when they photoshopped it, what they did is they photoshopped it off his wrist, but they forgot to photoshop it off the reflection on the table. So it was still there. But no, I don't think many people who follow this look at that as an independent entity.
Hi, I wanted to know, what do you think the chance is that Russia will either threaten or actually launch a small atomic bomb into Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, they've been, I think, making that threat now for about 8 weeks. Let me give you the optimistic view, and then I'll give you the pessimistic view. The optimistic view is that Vladimir Putin and senior Russians talk about nuclear weapons pretty loosely, and I would argue pretty irresponsibly, in ways that American leaders don't. Well, with the exception of one American leader, but he's in the past now. I also think that the Russians understand just what a nuclear conflict would be. But part of this is motivated by the Russian desire to say, we're a great power. It's nuclear weapons that are really the best claim Russia has to being a great power, which is one of the reasons why I believe Vladimir Putin tries to remind us so often that he has those nuclear weapons. I also think they do understand just how bad a nuclear war would be. So that's my optimistic assumption. And it was bolstered by the fact that in February, after Putin said he had ordered a special nuclear alert, the Pentagon said, we see no change in Russian nuclear force posture. And then there was a report that Defense Minister Shoigu reported back to Putin, and we've carried this alert out. It was basically adding a few people to headquarters staff. But you weren't seeing things that would make you worried. You didn't see Russian submarines surging out to sea. You didn't see that their mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles were leaving the garrisons and going out into the forests. So that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view, and this is pointed out by David Holloway, who is a colleague of mine at Stanford, is he says, if you look at Putin's speech on in Russian declaratory doctrine, they say there are two circumstances under which Russia would use nuclear weapons. One is if there's an attack on Russia or a Russian ally with a nuclear weapon or another weapon of mass destruction. Or two, if there's an attack on Russia in which the existence of with conventional forces only, in which the existence of the Russian state is at stake. And he says, if you look at that language and look at some of the language in the February 24 announcement, Putin's kind of saying, the existence of the Russian state, here is at stake. That's a reason, I think, to be a little bit concerned. Now, what I would look at and say, and here's where I guess I get a little bit nervous, is Russia can lose this war, and it's not an existential threat to Russia. If the Ukrainians drive the Russian forces out of Ukraine, the Ukrainian army is then not going to march on Moscow. So the Russian state survives intact. I'm not sure that if Russia loses this war, that Vladimir Putin survives in his current position. And so to how much does Putin sort of confuse his personal interest with the Russian interest? That makes me a little bit nervous, but I also think there are a lot of people around him who understand what a nuclear war would be, and they probably don't want to go there.
Can you please suggest some agencies to donate to help the Ukrainian people?
Let's see. Well, okay, we did
World Central Kitchen.
The
International Committee of the Red Cross and their Ukraine branch. Did you get that?
Yeah, International Committee of the Red Cross, and they have a Ukraine branch. There's actually a group called Nova Ukraine in Palo Alto that was actually started by a group of Stanford kids that's actually contributing and doing good work. And then there's one that we've also contributed called Come Home Alive, or Come Back Alive. And that does not buy weapons, but it does buy things like body armor, helmets, elbow pads, things like that. And it's designed to equip or give better equipment to the territorial defense forces.
I'm going to abuse my position to ask the last question here. And that's to take a kind of a broader perspective. I've been sort of every day for the last month, I've been waking up thinking, okay, today's when I'm going to read that Georgia has massed its military to retake the two, independent provinces that Russia has taken from Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And while all the Russian forces are in Ukraine and they're being depleted and all that, that now is the time to take back that territory. Why hasn't that happened, and should I expect it never to happen?
This has actually been one of the real question marks of this war, is that Georgia actually has not been as supportive of Ukraine as one would have thought. That there have been some compromises that they made over the past few years with Russia, but in fact I believe that the Ukrainian government several weeks ago actually called their ambassador home for consultations because they were concerned that Georgia seemed to be hanging back. Now my guess is that still Georgia, looking at their military capabilities, this would be the kind of thing I suspect that there still are probably 30-40% of the Russian ground forces that haven't gone into Ukraine, and that the Russians would act very, very quickly and very, very violently were Georgia to try something like that. But I've seen no indication in 10 weeks that the Georgians have even thought about that. So I can't explain that one.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
So first, a shout out to Comanche Winery, who's provided our little liquid sunshine as our token of thanks for your talking today. Thank you very much.